Welcome, dear reader, and thank you for your interest in the audiobook The Island of Stone, written by the excessively unknown author Thomas Gatt. The journey you are about to embark on combines elements of action, science fiction, and satire. But at its core, it's a book of love, spite, betrayal, bad people, and buffoonery. So please, sit back, relax, and let the words flow over you like a chocolate milk river. Chapter 1. Tim Stone. Tim Stone strode to the podium with the regality of a king. His demeanor, which was prearranged and purposeful, expressed a bold seriousness and intense discipline. His proud gait and polished appearance demanded the respect of others in a manner that was inoffensive yet unsettling. His wear on this occasion appropriately matched his presence. A bold suit, personally designed and hand-sewn in Italy by Giorgio Armani, made from virgin lamb's wool with an inner layer of ultra-fine silk. His shoes were fashioned from rare albino alligator skin from the jungles off the eastern sea of Paupau'i, handcrafted by the local Bwibi people. And his watch was one of a kind, a Swiss Supernova Turbo 5 made to withstand temperatures up to 2,000 degrees and kept time accurate to .001 seconds per 1,000 years. The employees applauded with giddy exuberance. "Stone! Stone! Stone!" they chanted. Mr. Stone, as he was known to all, raised his hand to signal silence, and the room fell quiet. He let the ambience linger for effect as he scanned from left to right, slowly nodding with casual poise. Then, when he felt the crowd was in proper suspense, the middle-aged CEO squinted in his all-knowing way and allowed a half-smile to creep across his clean-shaven face. A slight pause ensued, and the crowd roared again, this time stomping their feet and yapping indistinct sounds. Mr. Stone's long-awaited return had finally arrived. He began. "Good afternoon, people, and thank you for that wonderful welcome. As you know, I've just returned from an important business trip to the Isle of San Biokuchu, where I was scouting for potential products deep in the eastern jungle. Well, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the events I experienced there rattled me to the core, as they will you. But first, let me back up a bit. It all began 4 months ago on a Sunday afternoon, not long after my work party set out on four-wheelers. We were traversing along a narrow ridge with an abrupt edge on the perimeter of the Kukilu territory. The perilous conditions made us all anxious and snappy. Several times I snapped at the others as a matter of fact, chided our guides on their inability to guide. Despite the acknowledgement and seriousness of the situation, we weren't being as responsible as we should have been. We neglected proper road etiquette. Admittedly, there was a bit of playful bantering, even adolescent behavior on all our parts. We were ramming bumpers and taunting one another with mock-swerving motions and hurling harmless projectiles. Much of this was taking place when all of the sudden and without warning, Gerald Razor's quad stalled, coming to a complete halt directly in front of me. My panicked reaction completely bypassed any normal thought process, and I frantically clenched my right hand onto the nearest handle. God save my soul, I inadvertently grasped the accelerator, full throttle. Folks, I'm crushed to tell you that I careened into Gerald at full speed, knocking him off the high ridge where he tumbled like a ragdoll over 1,000 feet to a horrible death. Tim stopped at this point and took an emotional pause. The crowd was aghast. He continued, Yes, I know it's shocking news, and I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. As you can imagine, I'm terribly despondent over it myself. I had known our stalwart CFO for over 10 years. We worked on countless ventures together. Our families vacationed abroad, and our wives planned tea parties. We were close. Well, I'm sorry, but he's gone and there's nothing we can do about it. We must look forward to the future of Stone and Stone. So before I continue my story and announce his replacement, Helen Ranger would like to say a few words." At this point, a woman infamously familiar to the audience stepped up. Helen Ranger was a small, brutish woman, hence she was known as the Troll in underground circles. When she spoke, people recoiled in fear. She'd been at the company for nearly 5 years, having replaced the former HR manager after a tragic moped accident. Few were fond of Helen, and as a result avoided HR, which left her with little to do other than create superfluous documents and memos. Helen shambled to the podium in her light brown pantsuit, sporting a scowl of contempt. Her assistant ran ahead, snatching a hidden box from underneath the podium, placing it into position. Helen navigated the 12-inch stoop and placed her hands stiffly onto the podium. With her lips frozen downward and shoulders slumped, she began to speak. "Robert Zinkelmann is no longer with the company. We had to let him go due to unspecified circumstances. We appreciate his years of service." The crowd was stunned and confused. The news that Robert Zinkelmann, the vice president of operations, had been let go from Stone and Stone was unbelievable. He had been a staple of the company on par with the Stones for over 20 years. The thought of him being fired didn't make any sense. The troll continued. "Although I cannot disclose all the details, I will say that Robert was a thieving bastard who was out to steal Stone and Stone blind. We caught him red-handed and were left with no other choice. Robert is dead to us. We will be removing his picture from the Wall of Pride and will no longer be selling I Love Robert Zinkelmann pins from the company store." Several in the audience awkwardly looked down at their Robert Zinkelmann pins. "That is all?" Helen ended abruptly. She climbed down from her step and shambled toward the exit. Tim Stone returned to the podium and, upon reaching his place, casually nudged Helen's stoop to the side with his right foot. "All right then, that's that. Thank you, Helen." Mr. Stone collected his thoughts, scratched his chin and pressed on. "Okay, people, back to it. As I was saying, my visit to the Isle of Sambiokuku was highly eventful and has resounding implications for Stone and Stone, and more importantly, the world. Not surprisingly, the first thing we had to do was search for Gerald's body after lunch. A small team of employees and I proceeded to traverse the steep climb into the depths of the canyon on foot. Along the way, we kept hearing strange bellowing noises coming from below. To be safe, we sent 2 men ahead to try and find its source. They never returned. With only 3 of us left and dusk looming, we had to think fast. We collectively decided that the other 2 would search for the missing men while I stayed behind. People, you won't believe it when I tell you, but after about 30 minutes of waiting, fatigue set upon me, and I could no longer keep my eyes open. I'll be damned if I didn't fall asleep. During my unintended slumber, I had the strangest dream. I dreamt that Gerald Razor and I were flying through the clouds on our respective 4-wheelers, decorated with colored streamers and helium balloons. He was yelling something at the top of his lungs while staring at me gleefully and knowingly, and winked as I sat atop an adjacent puffy white cloud. Then, in an instant, he steered sharply and plummeted downward at warp speed, screaming unintelligible howls of ecstasy. Suddenly a rumbling began, and my puffy cloud began to shimmy. It was rapidly dispersing, and wispy chunks were flying off in all directions. I clamored for surface area, but soon was left grasping at air. I fell helplessly into an abyss as my screams echoed into nowhere. And boom, I snapped awake, covered in sweat and panting. I lay there for several minutes, slightly in shock, trying to regain my composure. I knew, instinctively, there must be some hidden meaning to my dream. Gerald had just fallen into the canyon hours prior, and this had to be a sign he was trying to contact me from beyond. Now fully awakened, I began to take note of my surroundings, scanning the horizon through the thick foliage. The sun had withdrawn, while lone giblets of light from the stars struggled through a somewhat cloudy sky. Dark shadows surrounded me on all sides, where the mysterious jungle loomed. I had to make a choice: search for my potentially fallen comrades, or struggle my way up the canyon in the dark. I made that difficult choice without regret. About an hour later, I reached the top of the canyon, exhausted and disoriented. I looked around, but everyone was gone. My heart skipped a beat at the thought of being stranded alone in the darkness, with my flashlight that was small and dim. With profound courage and utter determination, I did the only thing I could do: keep walking. I headed in the direction of the Sambiokuku village of Kwikul, our original destination. I had no way of knowing if my team had grown soft and turned tail back to boat, but it was my deepest hope that they had carried on with the mission. After another hour of walking, weariness began to overtake me. I thought of giving up several times, frequently stopping for rest periods. Each time I stopped, I would listen to the sounds in the canyon below, strange sounds. I could have sworn I heard the cadence of distant voices, human voices. Then, in contrast, primitive howlings trickled about the air, teasing my ears like a feather on a stream of wind. Just as I had convinced myself to go no further, I noticed that the narrow ledge began to trail sharply downward. Gods be good, I had finally reached the end of the most difficult part of the journey. The sharp decline made for a quick descent, and I was soon at its end. People, I tell you, it was perhaps the most beautiful sight I had ever laid eyes on, notwithstanding the Tukukual hills of Ruhiolwaz in Danunaki. The narrow decline sprawled into an expansive land of exquisite beauty. The cloudless sky glowed of the full moon, which shone down and pierced the shadowy foliage, hugging the edges of the open valley, casting intense shadows and shapes in all directions. Beyond were towering, robust trees which stood as guardians of the mighty jungle. To this inexpressible vision, my senses became overwhelmed. My eyes welled and my body trembled. I fell to my knees in the lush green grass and collapsed of exhaustion into a mighty slumber. When I woke, I felt the warmth of the morning sun upon my face. The squishy grass had formed a gentle cocoon around my body, and I was but a babe in the womb of the earth. Such solace it was that I could have remained for an eternity, if not for the distant calling of unknown voices. My first inclination was that my party was somewhere nearby. I froze in my womb-like position and listened intently, cocking my head and stretching my ear. After a long listen, I realized there was something odd about these voices. The reality of my situation began to settle in. I was in a vulnerable position. The voices were not voices at all, but strange beast-like chatter. What the hell was it? I quietly feared. I wriggled my way free, rolling to my side in the direction of the mad jingle, and squinted sharply, trying to catch a glimpse. I'll be damned if the foliage wasn't rustling about. My eyes widened and my palms grew damp. I instinctively tried to lower my position, realizing I was already on my belly. With my location secure, I scooched closer for a better look. The sounds grew louder and the foliage rustled with increasing intensity. People, I tell you, the oddest thing happened next. I'll be damned if a long, gangly arm sporting black hair didn't surface for a brief moment. I was taken aback. It was a primate of some sort. I watched with fierce astonishment as more glimpses of the yakking apes appeared, rustling about in the bush. After several more minutes, the loud procession stopped in an instant. People, I tell you that in that very second my heart stopped. I knew that the abrupt quiet was a sign of something bad forthcoming. I slammed my head to the ground and closed my eyes, trying to remain hidden. I held my breath so as not to pique the vile creatures. I laid still for what seemed an eternity, hoping it was all a bad dream. What happened next would have surely caused lesser men a coronary. I felt a gentle touch. A brushing would be more apt, actually, followed by increasingly forceful prods and pokes. Most were on my buttocks, upper legs, and love handles. I thought of an article I had read not 1 week before on bear attacks. The author advised to be still, cover your vitals, and play dead. These creatures were certainly no bears, but I quickly considered the strategy. I knew it was a risk. For all I knew, they thought I was dead, yet my exposed head was in grave danger. With the increasing bout of invasive prodding, I grew ever more fearful and acted instinctively, almost helplessly, as I feared for my life. Without further hesitation, I thrust my arms upward, wrapping my head and neck. At that very instant, the savages began to scream. Ungodly sounds. Quickly the howls grew more distant as they began to retreat in hysteria. My movement had obviously startled them. With savage urgency and little time, I had to act. I raised my head slowly in the direction of the fleeting screams. It was shocking, like a dream, seeing the apes in full view for the first time. There were at least 8 of them. Around half were female, which was evident by their drooping teats. The other half were small in stature, obviously pups. Their screams again intensified as my head rose, and even more so when I had risen to my feet and began running in the opposite direction. As I ran, I noticed something strange. Although I could not understand the screaming banter, I instinctively knew they were calling out to someone or something. My friends, I tell you, when I first heard the mighty roar, a shiver ran through my spine and my knees grew weak and nearly buckled. Christ, if it wasn't the most horrible sound I'd ever heard. making the screams of the females and fledgling chimps seem like a beautiful symphony. The sound filled the valley like a black cloud of death whose dark shadow bit at my heels. I ran faster. I was perhaps 100 yards from the edge of the jungle when I powerlessly turned to look. I had to know what the hell it was. Folks, I tell you truly, and withdrawing all pride, that when I saw what was coming, I relieved myself helplessly. It was a giant male ape, heavily muscled and barrel-chested, running at top speed. In that instant I knew I was a goner, yet I ran on. Not 5 seconds later, a swipe clipped my heel so violently that I managed a 360-degree turn through the air as I was propelled forward, landing on my right ankle, which collapsed underneath me and snapped as I slammed face-first into the ground, somersaulting 3 more times as pieces of my front teeth shattered and were expelled from my mouth. Without a second to gather my wits, the beast pounced on me with such force that I was sure several ribs had broken. The wind was knocked out of me with such force I vomited. Almost instantly, the crazed monster took hold of my left ankle and began swinging me wildly in a circle over his head as I choked and gasped for air. The centrifugal force generated was further nauseating as I spun in frantic circles. In my half-conscious state, I eked out the blurry haze of erect figures. The other apes had gathered around the perimeter of our tussle. I'll be damned if they didn't appear to be cheering and screaming. Several were pumping their ape fists in the air, while others jumped up and down, shaking their heads and sticking out their tongues with mad glee. I knew my situation was desperate. If these freaks had their way, I'd be ripped limb from limb. People, there's no gentle way to put this to you. Due to the rapid twirling motion, my soiled trousers began to eject their contents, which flew in the face of the beast. He suddenly stopped and scanned me quizzically like a toy in one hand as he touched his defiled face with the other. I can only guess he took insult. He bared his teeth and screamed once more his savage cry, tossing me like a child over the heads of the onlookers in multiple horizontal spins. My limbs and other bodily parts broke as I bounced erratically and violently, tumbling out of control. Finally, I came to an abrupt stop where I lay twisted and mangled. Just before I lost consciousness, I could have sworn I heard the ape speaking in a language I could understand. Suddenly, Mr. Stone's cell phone rang. He halted his story and pulled the phone from its soft leather pouch. He glanced at the screen, then looked up. "Pardon me, people. I must take this. I'll have to finish my story at next week's Stone gathering. Have a nice day." And with that, Mr. Stone walked briskly toward the exit. As he approached the double doors, meek pieces of his conversation could be heard. "I told her, she's a damned bitch. Take care of her soon." The door closed behind him and the crowd began to disperse. The entire next week was abuzz with hallway and coffee room chatter about Mr. Stone's adventure. There were so many unanswered questions. What happened to the others? Was Gerald Razor's body finally recovered? And how did Mr. Stone survive his encounter with the apes? The suspense was almost unbearable.